Hello and welcome to the CFB Super Show. I'm your host, Walter Waddell, aka Deuce85, and joined after a 1-week hiatus by the international man of mystery that is Jake Kuchek. Excited to have him back in the hot seat with me this week as we dial into week 8. If you're a new watcher of the show, welcome. We do several things here. We cover DFS majority of time, but we do talk about PrizePicks as well, and some betting opportunities. We'll be going over all of this stuff for the Saturday main slate from DK. We do primarily focus on DraftKings, but if you have FanDuel questions and you're watching live or on demand, we will answer those as we go. It is something I definitely talk about in the Discord and in the write-ups. If you're a returning viewer of the show, welcome back. We appreciate that continued support. Hung out with me last night as we talked about some of these crazy weekday slates. Make sure you smash the like button. Continue to support us with interacting with the show. We'll answer any comments, questions, concerns that you have. And then at the end of the show, we'll kind of wrap up with what's ahead for article-wise shows remaining for the rest of this week and beyond. With that being said, before we dive in and kind of talk about what we're going to do here, Jake, why don't you, the viewers at home want to know how was the trip to Spain, the flight? I'm curious to know how dreadful the flight was and how was the overall experience. Let's talk about that for a second, because not every day you know somebody who goes to Spain.
Yeah, no, trip was great. Flight obviously was pretty long. The way there, everything went pretty smoothly. I did have a connection in Germany, but that went off without a hitch. Very, efficient airport in Frankfurt, Germany, to get from one part of the terminal to the other. It was I was actually really lucky on the way over there. I was in an aisle seat, and the middle seat between myself and the person on the other side of the aisle, we were in the middle. It was like a 3-3-3 configuration, and the middle seat was empty. So I had aisle to my right and empty seat to my left, and can't ask for anything better than that on an 11-hour international flight. So it's really pretty happy about that. Got there, spent some time in Barcelona. Tried to make it to a Barcelona soccer match. Didn't get through customs on time to make it to that, but still had a good time kind of exploring the city until the wee hours once I got there, and then headed down, or I guess up the coast along the Mediterranean to the wedding venue, and we were at this villa kind of close to the French border in, like, I guess northeastern Spain. And it just, exactly what you would imagine, very scenic. Kind of reminded me, the town that it was in kind of reminded me, if there's any Godfather fans out there, the scene in which Michael goes back to Italy when he's in hiding in Godfather 1. It was very reminiscent of that town, and kind of seemed like it could have existed, in the 1940s or whenever that was. It was very, very old school, but food was amazing, scenery was amazing. Also, incredibly affordable once you're there. 13 euros, which is, basically at parity with dollars. So $13 essentially got you a 3-course meal with whatever drink of your choice for a very hearty lunch, the kind of lunch that makes you not sure you want to have dinner. It was pretty amazing, and it was quality stuff too, like not a cheap meal. And the wedding that I was there for and was a groomsman in, beautiful wedding, a little bit of a smaller crowd, and primarily a Spanish speaking crowd. So I got to, especially after a couple cocktails, got to try out my Spanish a little bit. Didn't always go well. They kind of coached me back into, hey, we actually speak a little bit of English too. Maybe that would work out better. But was a really good time, and got back on time, ended up getting the flu and giving that to my wife when I got back. So that part wasn't great, but sometimes you pay for it when you travel, right? So
yeah, definitely. Well, we're
Yeah.
glad to have you back, man. It was an interesting week. I know you were chiming in and popping in throughout the Discord. I know you personally had a very good PrizePicks day, so you made some good money there. I'd mentioned that yesterday for people who watched, and that's something we're going to continue to do as we turn the corner here. We're at the second half of the season. This is about last year when, week 7, week 8, week 9 for me and a lot of the people who sub to us or are members kind of turned the corner and started really turning it into a very profitable season. It's about the time you kind of discovered PrizePicks. You took off for that. DFS wise, we're at least competitive lineups. I know last week was crazy with the highest scores, but we actually had some really good scores out there, some high scores, some profit that people posted throughout the slate. So feeling confident heading into this one. We have 13 game slate that we're going to break down here. We're going to still go position by position, but we're going to switch it up a little bit. We're going to talk about our favorite 3, and there may be some overlap there because we didn't talk about it before. I wanted it to be a surprise. And then at the end of that, after we've kind of talked about each of our favorite 3 at the position, we'll kind of open forum and mention anyone else that we're looking at, whether that's for values, GPPs, maybe we don't like, that kind of thing. And then at the end, we'll give a 3-man core as we do, talk about some of the PrizePicks stuff, and then any betting props that I've seen or betting opportunities. So please make sure you guys get your betting questions in there as well. All right, so starting off, just to go over a couple of the lines and totals on this particular slate, there's some games they left off that they should have probably included, but whatever, that always happens. UCLA versus Oregon is a 70.5 total, so lots of points expected there. Ole Miss and LSU 67 total over there on DraftKings, which is pretty nice. And then the Texas Tech West Virginia game is a 65. You have a couple games in the low 60s and then a bunch of 49, 52, 54. So it's going to be probably a lower scoring slate, which I think will drive a lot of ownership into these high total games with a bunch of stacks. So we can use our knowledge to kind of find some sneaks in different positions and stacks ourselves. But that's kind of what I'm looking at here with these totals and how I predict the ownership to go. Starting with quarterbacks here, I am going to these aren't in like priority order. There's just 3 that I'm really looking at, this week and going to probably have 2 of them in my main lineup. And I've been kind of trimming my player pool down each week to kind of help people out anyways. But it does start with this UCLA Oregon game, and it's certainly not paying over $9K for Bo Nix. I know Bo Nix has been great. I just can't bring myself to pay that price, and it may burn me. But I am looking instead at Dorian Thompson-Robinson, and I think that it seems like a no-brainer play to use him, but I'm looking at some of the other stuff that people are posting on Twitter and just the overall conversations I'm having, and it seems like people might end up overlooking him slightly because some of these quarterbacks in this slate are really severely underpriced, and I think DTR is just one of those guys that people habitually overlook. Charbonnet is probably going to have a lot of ownership at the running back spot, so DTR is just going to be in a really nice spot to put up a ton of points here and maybe not carry more than 15 to 18% ownership. That's great for us. Elite matchup against Oregon. Absolutely. Oregon's defense is, in the past been elite. That's not the case anymore. Anytime they faced an at least half decent quarterback like your guy Cam Ward, he lit them up. Delora was okay. They've had some pretty brutal outings in the secondary. So I think DTR is going to do just fine there. Total of almost 71. This is clearly going to be a shootout. And anytime DTR has been in an environment with lots of high scoring, like against my Huskies, he's just really thrived. That was one of his best games, and I think he could mirror that. I've been really impressed by the fact that he's completed 75% of his passes. I did a bet-sided, fan-sided show earlier this week where we talked about this game in specific, and he's not really, he's kept his interceptions down throughout his career. He only has 2 right now, but his accuracy hasn't been that great, but he's just killing it career-wise, completing 75% of those passes. So we feel pretty good about his O-line blocking for him. He has over 1,500 yards, 15 touchdowns. In case you think he's not rushing anymore, he still has that element to his game. 231 rushing yards, 4 touchdowns, so you still have to account for that. Jake Bobo, the Duke transfer, has been a godsend for him. He's really got a good connection with DTR. is a guy that just defenses aren't finding for whatever reason. And the running game still, like I said, with Sharps and him have to be accounted for. So I'm pretty high on DTR. It's a spot where at 7-9, it's a price point where I think, people, are they going to decide, do they want to just go to Hartman, who's in a great spot, Stroud, or do they want to pay down for some of these cheapy guys? And I really do believe in my heart that he's going to be one of those lower owned guys, 10% lower than he should be. He's not gonna be like 5% or something, but he really should be like 30% on the slate, and he probably won't be. Kind of feel like him, like I did 2 weeks ago with Will Rogers, kind of my conviction play. Will be all over him. Next one is Michael Pratt from Tulane, and this one's tough because I want the running back as well, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Severely underpriced on DK. He has thrown for 300 plus yards in 3 of his last 5 games. Comes into it, over 1,500 yards, 11 touchdowns, only 3 picks, so another fairly accurate guy. He's also rushed for almost 200 yards and 4 touchdowns, so a dual threat guy that people sometimes forget he has that ability to do so. Memphis games have been shooting out, so that's great. They're going down to the wire. A couple of heartbreaker losses for them recently, with Houston, and then last week in that, quad OT game against Eastern Carolina, which was wild. Had 2 players in that game and somehow lost my way in that one. But Memphis has been giving it up in droves to opposing quarterbacks. Like last week in the overtime period, Eilers, he had 304 and 1, rush for a touchdown. And in those overtimes, it wasn't really him. Keaton Mitchell did most of the heavy lifting, so Eilers had most of that 304 yards in the actual regulation. Clayton Tune threw for 330 or 366 and 3. He also rushed for a touchdown. Your boy from North Texas, Austin Owen, he threw for 371 and 3. And then a couple of weeks before that for Arkansas State, James Blackman, he was just under 300 yards and 2 touchdowns as well. So any, capable quarterback has done very well against this Memphis defense. They play kind of a faster pace anyways, which keeps their defense on the field a lot because Memphis scores very quickly. And I think Pratt's going to be a guy that we can definitely rely on. He is one of those kind of, severely underpriced QBs that I think will see ownership spike a lot. He's probably going to be this week's Rourke. I know last week, the Maction game didn't really work out. Rourke was really cheap and he did throw for over 200 yards, but the touchdowns just didn't come his way. A lot more rushing touchdowns that we saw. I don't think that's going to be the case with Pratt. It sets up almost the exact same way with his price, the matchup, the total, everything looks good for him. I think the result will be a lot different though, and he'll actually come through for us and the majority of the field. So don't feel too bad about using him. And then lastly, I think it's the Texas Tech quarterback, I will say. I think it's going to be Baron Morton. I think the era of Morton is here. I was very hesitant to try to use him when he first got the start and came in. We thought Donovan Smith was hurt, came out that he wasn't injured at all. They just never – people were speculating. The coaching staff just never said anything about it. Donovan Smith ended up taking a couple snaps at wide receiver. Looks like they're just kind of done with him at the moment. Tyler Shuck is starting to get to a position where he's going to be able to warm up, but I think the Morton era is here. He was very good. I think I'm an instant believer in him, actually. Tossed it 62 times in that game against Oklahoma State, and we know the Cowboys defense is pretty suspect, so we have to kind of reel that in. Threw for 379 yards, 2 touchdowns. He rushed for 50 yards and a touchdown, so we got to see some rushing ability there. The price is up to $7K, so maybe that gives people pause. Maybe they don't want to chase that performance. But talk about elite spots like it was against Oklahoma State. The West Virginia defense is just as good a spot, if not better than Oklahoma State. They're giving up almost 265 yards per game through the air. Some of the quarterback performances against them, Blake Shapen just recently in a game where he actually got hurt, he still threw for 326 yards. 2 touchdowns. Hudson Card, who is a backup quarterback, he threw for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. Jalen Daniels, the great Jalen Daniels, 219 yards, 3 touchdowns, also rushed for 85 yards. And then way back at the beginning of the season, Kadon Slovis threw for 308 yards. Just 1 touchdown, but still 300-plus yards. Morton is going to throw the ball probably 50 times minimum. We see West Virginia with JT Daniels. They're going to be tossing it. They're going to be into these shootout type of games. Sets up as a very good spot for him, and he's in that price point where I think people will probably stray away a little bit because again, there's 2 or 3 other guys under 7.5 that I think are going to get more of the ownership, rostership, however you want to phrase it. But I'm really quite in love with those 3 guys right now as it stands at the moment. But after hearing what you have to say, I may change my mind because you have a way to be quite persuasive. So what quarterbacks are you looking at? If there's any that I've said that you're on, that's okay. That just further drives home the point that they're the play.
So just a quick note on the Texas Tech situation. The most up-to-date I have it is that they're going to both go, which kills both of them, I think.
Yeah.
So Donovan Smith is expected to play alongside, unless he's playing slot receiver, then you can
You never know.
Baron Morton. But Donovan Smith expected to play alongside Baron Morton, which is like, man, that's a bummer, right? Like that's the thing you don't want to see is two quarterbacks going. And so hopefully there's some clarity and like Donovan Smith is available while Baron Morton will be the undisputed QB1. Hopefully we get something like that before kickoff. But just, quick note on that we really need to continue to follow that situation.
Yeah. And then real quick, it doesn't help either that there's a lot of message board chatter that Tyler Shuck, I said he's going to come back and warm up, but people are thinking he's going to play. So that could further complicate things. So
yeah, it's a shame, man. Cause like with the whole Kitley thing, like you just want, okay, we have our dude. That's going to be that dude, and for that dude to not get hurt. That's all. Yeah. That's all you could ask for the Texas Tech offense. It's been like the literal opposite of that. Like we don't know who the dude is, and he keeps getting hurt. Is the situation. So we'll see. But yes, whoever ends up throwing the majority of passes for Texas Tech ought to have a very good game. We can at least agree on that much.
Yep.
So for my three guys, I'm gonna talk about Iowa for a little bit, and that doesn't mean I'm using Petrus, but it does mean that we need to talk about who Iowa has played and why everyone is scared of Iowa as a defense, especially with regard to quarterback play. So San Diego State, Iowa State, Nevada, Rutgers, Michigan, and Illinois. Is there a single quarterback in there that you would consider to be a moderate even quarterback? I don't think so. Like there's just not good quarterback play on any of those teams. They're going to go from that abyss of terrible quarterback play to probably the number one overall pick in next year's draft and Ryan Day's offense and 3 first-round receivers whenever they decide to move on to the NFL. Iowa is going to get the doors blown off of them. They have not seen an offense like this all season. They've not seen an offense since the last time that they played Ohio State that has this kind of firepower. And the price on Stroud, plus like the fact that, and I think it's really silly that people go by this, but they see, opponent rank 8th. Like people are going to be scared off of CJ Stroud just because they see that without looking at who Iowa's played and that there's not really much quarterback play. Now Stroud, on the other side of that, he hasn't been, the elite CJ Stroud in terms of fantasy production that maybe we were expecting this season, but it's because he's done by the second quarter. And even if he technically is playing in the third quarter, like they're not pushing the envelope. They're up by 30 points and it's the foot off the gas and Mayan Williams just taking it to everyone. I think there is going to be an opportunity, and we kind of thought that a little bit in the Michigan State game, and then they still kind of blew him out a little bit too much. He's even in that blowout scenario, 361 yards and 6 touchdowns in a game that wasn't competitive ever. So if for whatever reason Iowa can punch in a couple scores or at least make him, take a little bit longer to matriculate down the field so that we're chewing up a little bit more clock and gives Ohio State reason to continue to play competitively throughout the third and possibly even into a fourth quarter. This could be that 50-point CJ Stroud game that hasn't happened yet. And the thing I'm concerned about the least is Iowa's defense stopping him. I don't see Iowa's defense stopping him one bit. I do see Iowa's offense not being able to keep up with Ohio State's offense. And so that's the concern that we've had all year with CJ Stroud. The difference is We're in the third week in October, fourth week in October. At some point, he's got to play a full game, right? And so we're deep enough into conference play. 360 and 6 is a pretty good game. If we can get that again at 9-2, that's probably pretty good. If we can get more than that, maybe we see him tuck it and run it a little bit, which we haven't seen him do at all this year, but we know that he can do. We get a little bit more efficiency out of him, not needing him to throw for all of those touchdowns. So I'm big on Stroud. I don't think he's going to be very highly owned at all. I think that there's a lot of factors that would lead people to go elsewhere. And I think when you have the best quarterback available and nobody interested in him, and he's getting a healthy JSN back this week, I think that's an extremely compelling scenario. Next guy, there's two guys named Daniels that I'm interested in on this slate. It kills me because he's been terrible except for last week, but something got into Jaden Daniels. I don't know. Go into the swamp and put up a career game, 349 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, and adding another 3 on the ground. And now he gets a home game in a 70-point total, 60 something, right? 60 right. Pretty high. I think we got to pay attention to Jaden Daniels, even though Jaden Daniels is terrible, or we've been conditioned to think that Jaden Daniels is terrible. He hasn't actually turned the ball over a ton, which is one of the things that I would have been concerned with him going into SEC play, is that we start to see him melt down and have a lot of turnovers. But at Auburn, didn't play particularly well, but at least was clean from the turnover perspective. I guess he did lose a fumble, but also scored one on the ground. Against Tennessee, didn't play particularly well. The offense didn't play particularly well, but just the one interception, and then completely clean game at Florida. Very tough game environment. Now he gets a home game that I think were they actually favored in that? Did I see that right?
For LSU?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're 2-point favorites.
They're 2-point favorites. I'm a little surprised by that. Maybe you touch on that in your betting segment a little bit, but not sure how they ended up favored in that one. But the fact that they are, and the fact that they're not like 2-score dogs, leads me to believe that Jaden Daniels might actually show out a couple weeks in a row. And 7,700, it's you're not shelling out too much for what is a fantastic game environment. And then I'm going to keep going back to the well. This will be the 3rd week in a row that I have interest in Quinn Ewers. Obviously against Oklahoma, they could do whatever they wanted. And then it got out of hand pretty quickly. And so he didn't necessarily have the ceiling that he could have had that game, but still put up, close to 30 fantasy points. Iowa State, much tougher game. Still ended up going a lot less on the passing yardage. Didn't even get to 200 yards, but he did throw for 3 touchdowns. And not a guy that we expect to run the ball a ton, but again, protecting the ball, has an amazing talent in Xavier Worthy that I think doesn't get enough credit. I mean, some of the moves that we saw from Xavier Worthy, at least to me, were reminiscent of Devontae Smith, like the kind of body control and athleticism that I haven't seen since Devontae Smith. And so with a defense that will likely be keyed on Bijan Robinson, who also is a fantastic weapon in the passing game. I think that the sky's the limit for Quinn Ewers, and he's already been tested in a pretty tough environment, against Iowa State and held his own. Going into Oklahoma State, that game always gets pretty interesting and usually is a little bit more high scoring than we expect. So down at 6,400, I certainly also see the argument for Pratt in that same price range, and I wouldn't be opposed to pairing those two if you want to save quite a bit of dollars and spend those dollars elsewhere. But he's going to be my cheapie lower end quarterback that I have quite a bit of interest in.
Love it. Yeah. Ewers was so good against Oklahoma, and I ended up chickening out on using him in my main, and it was fine because I think that was the week we used I used Rodgers and Sanders, but man, he's looked really damn good. And I'm interested to definitely see how he follows that up. This is the week where I think, last week they were favored by like 16 against Iowa State. I thought that was pretty crazy. I thought that was an overreaction to the week prior. So this is a week where we're really going to see if they have what it takes. They're 6-point favorites against Oklahoma State. So it'll be really interesting to see how they step up there in another really solid matchup. So yeah, 3 different quarterbacks from each of us, a total of 6 there for you guys. We'll kind of open forum it now for any remaining guys. I will say that this is for me a quarterback slate. It's definitely a 2 quarterback slate once again. We haven't had many 4 running back slates. It's been mostly the secondary ones, like last Saturday night on the late night slate with our guy Parson from Hawaii. But there are some really intriguing options. One of the other ones that I'm looking at here is Seth Hennigan on the other side of that Tulane game, sitting there at 6'2". He really doesn't get enough, I think, attention. Maybe not, definitely not in the football world, but just in DFS fantasy purposes in general. And I know he's had a couple of rough outings. The Houston game, he was not great. Temple, he threw 45 times, but somehow didn't have over 20 fantasy points. The touchdowns just weren't there. He did rush for 60 yards in that game, has some pretty sneaky rushing upside. North Texas game, he didn't do very well, but, he has had some 27-plus fantasy point games, 3 of them in all. The ECU game there in overtime, threw for over 400 yards, 2 touchdowns, did get picked off twice, scored a rushing touchdown. Tulane's defense is definitely much tougher, at least on paper, than what they saw against ECU and Houston and definitely Temple. But I think on the road, we're going to see him have one of those games where he throws, 40 to 45 times. And at 6'2", we get 350 yards and even just 2 touchdowns or 50 yards on the ground in a touchdown. And he can obliterate that. And with the field, at least in my estimation, all over Pratt in this game, switching to the other side in your, alt lineups, GPPs or whatever, could give you a huge, 5% compared to 35% ownership. And if he outscores Pratt, you're going to jump all those people. And then you can come back around and kind of, feel pretty good about what you have left there. I know it's a later game, so it's not like you can do any swapping or anything. But if you're right about that, that pivot, you could really do some serious damage on this particular slate. So, one other quarterback I do want to mention, then we'll see some of the other options for you. Purdue, their passing defense is really not good. Nobody talks about this because usually when Purdue's on the slate, it's all about Aiden O'Connell, all about their offense. Got to get Purdue. I wasn't on Casey Thompson last week, but I will admit that I fell into the biggest luck box Trey Palmer game of all time. I will admit that. I thought he would do good, 20 fantasy points, right? But not 55. I feel pretty damn good about the Trey Palmer game. That's on that later slate that I did well. 7 catches, 237 yards. But that just shows you, Casey Thompson threw for over 350 yards, 2 touchdowns. That Purdue offense is really fun, but they also score very, very quickly. And I'm looking at pace this year, and there's a lot of teams that are just playing at a much faster pace than they have in the past. It's causing their defenses to just gas out, and we're seeing these situations. Now, Graham Mertz, at 5'2" is not a play that I would use unless I was going to play 25 to 300 lineups. No, I'm just kidding. 30 lineups, right? The 30 to 40 lineups. I'd play some Graham Mertz. That game against Northwestern, with the new coaching staff, he looked good. Reverted back to being really trash again last week, although he did throw 2 touchdowns, so that's solid. I think we see him at home here against Purdue actually kind of flirt with a 250-3 game. Shamir Adike and Skylar Bell, really capable wide receivers. Braylon Allen, an all-world running back, still only 19 years old, 18 years old, something like that. Has a really good supporting cast around him, and I think at 5'2", I wouldn't be shocked to see Mertz have 25 this week against Purdue. I know that might sound crazy, but he's definitely got that capability, and only at 5'2". I'm not ready to just say that Wisconsin Graham Mertz is a complete fade at that price point. But I will need multiple lineups to get there. So with that being said, what are some of the other targets here at QB that you like?
Yeah. So once we start getting into like the crazy GPP only territory, like definitely don't put this guy in your cash lineups. You can get a little bit more creative.
Yeah.
One dude who is like that for me is Jason Bean. Jason Bean is like the most high variance outcome quarterback that is possible. Like you could not construct a guy who I would be more scared to put in a cash lineup because like you could get 5 interceptions and 2 fumbles out of Jason Bean and end up with like -7 points. Or you could get what he did last week against Oklahoma. It was actually a pretty respectable fantasy game. Like it was an interesting football game too. Like it seemed like Oklahoma was blowing them out that entire game, and then you look up at the end and it was a 10-point game, and Kansas with a backup quarterback against Oklahoma. I feel like that's a pretty decent result for Kansas, right? And so a lot of garbage time and like dudes were just running wide open, and even Jason Bean was able to hit them. Didn't really see him do a ton on the ground. He kind of hasn't done that this year. It was a little bit surprising because that was a pretty big part of his game in the past. And then like they even have had at times, even when Jalen Daniels was the man, they would have packages for Jason Bean to like come in and do the old Tim Tebow thing, come in and be big and run people over. I would have liked to see him do a little bit more of that when he was the quarterback too. I mean, obviously they have to preserve his body a little bit, but that game's probably going to be a fairly high scoring affair. And as a GPP play, it's gross, but I'm still kind of interested, even at the more elevated price point that he's at now at 7,300. And then a guy that like I don't know if we've talked about him once, other than to mention the random proclivity for his rushing attack, but Jackson Dart. Jackson Dart had the most ridiculous stat line last game, like at halftime or something. He had 6 completions, but 3 of them had gone for touchdowns at that point. And he's not a big part of what they do there, which is odd because he's kind of the handpicked quarterback and has the same SC connections as Lane Kiffin and all that. Didn't throw for a ton of yardage this past week against Auburn. Previous week threw for 448 and 3 against Vanderbilt, and in this one, but he did rush for 115 yards this past week against Auburn. So it is not all Evans and Judkins. That they are obviously a very large part of what Ole Miss does. But Jackson Dart seems to involve himself one way or another. What we haven't really seen yet is the game where he throws for 300 and also runs for 100, and maybe gets 5 touchdowns total between the two. Hopefully at least a couple of those are rushing. That would be a very good fantasy game. And if there's an environment in which, that could be possible, LSU with all of a sudden competent offense that can hang with this Ole Miss team, I think it's interesting. At 6,700, he's expensive enough that he's not, too much of a discount to the point where people are playing him over like the Pratt Hennigan zone, but he's also not so expensive that he's in the DTR and Jaden Daniels, Spencer Sanders territory. So he's kind of in no man's land with regard to pricing. No one is really interested in playing him ever, and it could very well be a spot where he kind of puts together the both by air and by land game that we haven't seen yet. So going to hesitate to say he's a dart throw in a GPP, but I think I'm going to have my two wild cards be Jason Bean and Jackson Dart.
I dig that. And then just wrapping it up, a couple of other plays here. There are some injuries besides, and what the Texas Tech getting healthy at this time. Blake Shapen is questionable. He got hurt late in the game. He could possibly miss out on this Kansas game, which he's actually a really nice play if he does play. They'll be looking at running their backup Kieran Drones at 6'1". He didn't look good at all, but our resident Baylor expert Fate in the Discord said he likes Drones and wants a Baylor stack, but he also is a Baylor super fan. So, what does he really know? And then Ben Bryant for Cincinnati has a concussion. He's hopeful to play. Concussion's really one of those things. You're either better or you're not, right? It's not a game time decision. It's just like, does this kid have a concussion or not? and so we'll see what happens there. I do believe Cincinnati will rely on their run game, which we'll get to here in a second anyways, but just some housekeeping news to really look at. For Wake Forest, Sam Hartman, he's always like that 350-3 guy. They've done a nice job of at least pricing him to a level at 8-9 where I don't have to feel bad about fading him. He's got an easy matchup against Boston College. He will throw for 350-3, but it's one of those games where if he goes for like 5 touchdowns at 5%, I won't have to feel really distraught about it because he's almost 9K and I can spend my money a little bit better. But he is there, somebody to consider, and he's always going to have those stat lines. And then at down here at 5K for Notre Dame, Drew Pine. I'm not really that interested in him, but again, another cheapie. UNLV is a very simple matchup. They'll want to run the ball on them probably, but this is a good spot to get Pine some confidence throwing the football somewhere like what he did against North Carolina, 24 for 34, 289-3. Against BYU, 22 for 28, 262-3. Was awful against Stanford, but those two games prior, really solid stat lines where he was right in between 22 to 25 fantasy points. At 5K, that's definitely doable at home. I think he will bounce back after a treacherous, outing. I think Mayer will bounce back. So I have a little bit of interest there at 5K. Yet another cheapie to look at. All right. Checking in with the chat. We got my man Alex, the NC State super fan there. He says, welcome back, Jake. Yep, we got your fans there. And then why the hell is UNLV Notre Dame on the slate game? I'm just talking about, they could have done Liberty BYU, would have been infinitely better. Or North Texas UTSA, probably a long shot for that one. But they could have definitely had the BYU game, but I don't think they've had Liberty on a slate yet, which is kind of upsetting. They're keeping Day Hunter out of my grasp for a little bit longer at least. All right, moving on to the running back position. There is a plethora of good options from Bijan Robinson, who we got away with fading last week at his high price tag. He had his normal, solid over 100-yard game, but he was under 30, so it didn't hurt us too bad. And then you have some really strong options between 6 to 7K that I would be fine using any of them at all. So you start us off here. Give us your top 3 or preferred 3 options at the running back position here.
Yeah. So first one I'm going to go with, and it doesn't necessarily mean he's my first overall play, but an axiom of this season has been running backs against Stanford. Just anybody, if they're playing Stanford, they're getting decent touches. They're probably going to have a pretty good game. Happen to have Xavier Valade, who when they're playing a competitive game, especially if they're playing in a competitive game that they're going to have the lead in, Xavier Valade is a good play almost every time that's the case. And I think that they have a really good opportunity to feature him against Stanford, in games that they've been competitive in. He's been over 100 yards pretty much every time. Even the USC game where he didn't get to 100 yards on the ground, he still scored a couple times, got in some work in the passing game. made it to 25 fantasy points. So not to say that he's matchup proof, but he's a little bit, game script proof, just because he does get involved in the passing game as well. Has scored receiving touchdowns in each of his last 2 games, that USC game that I mentioned, and then also against Washington, which I'm sure you remember. But just incredible matchup for how much volume I think that he's going to get. I mean, he had 27 touches last week, and could see that push up even closer to 30 with them, potentially having the ball a little bit more. And they've kind of realized that he truly is the guy. Like, mixing in Nada at the beginning of the year, they're kind of paying lip service to that, I think. But this is Xavier Valladay's team, and he is just going to pound it down Stanford's throat, and they're not really going to be able to stop it. So I think 100 yards and 2 touchdowns is probably the floor, and we have a good amount of upside from there. Sticking right in that same price range, we've got the guy that we will play on any slate that he's on, Zach Charbonnet from UCLA, your boy Sharbs. Very consistent in terms of volume in the last couple of weeks. 22 carries each of the last 2 weeks, and that's actually up from his volume against Colorado, where they probably didn't need him as much, that game being kind of a blowout. But just lots of efficiency, breaks tackles like nobody's business. Has seen some work in the passing game in competitive games. So we'll probably see him featured, in both the running game and in the passing game frequently. I think he probably does get 100 yards and a score. Probably gets 30 to 40 yards receiving. If he gets into the end zone multiple times, we're looking at a pretty big day from him too. And he's at 6,700. So not necessarily a slate where you have to pay up a ton for your running backs, and you probably are going to have to pay up a little bit more at the receiver position. But those two, I think, are fantastic plays that are below 7K. And then sticking with guys that are in appealing matchups, think we're gonna go. Yeah, let's go with Chase McClellan. So in that same price range, 6,100. SMU is one of those teams that we've been kind of picking on all season, defensively from all aspects, but particularly in the running game, giving up some pretty big games pretty much all year. And while the Cincy backfield has been a little bit hard to peg in terms of what that pecking order actually is, and it was kind of, for a while it seemed like a different guy was going off every week. Starting to, at least in my analysis and opinion, starting to coalesce a little bit around Chase McClellan as kind of the guy, not necessarily to the level that Jerome Ford was at last season, where we would see a guaranteed 25 carries every single game. I don't think he's hit that threshold yet, just because they've been focused a little bit more on the passing game. But as you mentioned, quarterback has a concussion, which means you either have a quarterback that just had a concussion and want to protect him a little bit, or you don't have that quarterback and you have a backup quarterback and you want to protect your quarterback a little bit. So either way, I think we're going to get a good amount of volume, might get to that 25 carry threshold for Chase McClellan, and he has a fantastic matchup to exploit, that and be efficient, put up a lot of fantasy points. So that'll be my third guy, Chase McClellan, 6,100 for Cincinnati.
Love it. So we mirrored on 2 of the 3, but I am glad, and McClellan wasn't one of the 3, but I definitely love that spot. SMU's giving up 209 rushing yards per game. That's been one that people are really kind of late to get to, and we've been able, like you said, to exploit it, and that's been great. McClelland is getting almost 50% of the team's carries, so that's gone up over the last couple of weeks. Corey Kiner sitting there around 30%, so he still looms large. And with the quarterback injuries, we'll probably see both get a lot of work, but I really like McClelland to go over 100 yards between the two. So I agree with you there. Sharps is always matchup proof. I'm the big, I'm banging the drum for him as always, so I love that. And then Valladay, even if, they end up having to pass a lot for whatever reason, or Stanford tries to stop the run, even though they can't, he's really active in the passing game. He's caught 13 of his 17 targets. Stanford's giving up 197.5 rushing yards. He has over 100 yards receiving, a couple of touchdowns. He's just the perfect complement to Emory Jones, because Jones is, not really that air it out type of guy, and you can dump it off to him for short yardage stuff, which opens up the rest of the running game. So yeah, Sharps and Valladay were two of my three, but that's okay. I have some other ones, but that just really solidifies those two as a, main plays for us. If you're not looking at Pratt, then I think you want to go to Tyjae Spears. He's another one of my, I'm very famous for not that I'm famous, but for between you guys having these guys that I just play every single slate when they're on it. Tyjae Spears is definitely one of those guys for me. Almost 50% of the carries for Tulane. Over 460 yards, 8 touchdowns, another running back active in the passing game, 18 total targets, which is, I believe, 4th on the team, 15 catches, 195 yards, and a touchdown. Memphis giving up over 400 yards of total offense, a lot of that in the passing game, just because of how they're kind of get into shootouts, score back and forth. But I do think we'll see Spears get quite a bit of work here just to kind of slow things down and keep Memphis from getting their offense onto the field. And even if it does turn into a situation where they're making passes, then Spears is perfectly capable of thriving in that situation too. Tulane has been on the slate, was it one time so far this year? I think it was against Houston. In that game, he had 54 yards rushing, not great, but he caught 6 passes for 85 yards, a touchdown, put him up to 67 fantasy points, right around 5.3. He wasn't that highly owned. I believe that was a smaller slate, but not a lot of people were on him. We were pretty heavily invested, and it worked out. And I think I could see something similar where, his rushing yardage may not hit the 75 to 100 yard threshold that you'd love to see at this price, but he's going to get so much work otherwise that he's going to score probably 2 touchdowns. That PPR, 3 to 5 catches will put him well over his expected value at 5.7. So Spears is one of those guys in my top 3 at the moment. As I delve further into it over the next 36 hours, he may, become more of a GPP spot depending on what I do with Pratt. But I want one of those guys in my 3 main lineups that I run. I run usually just 1 main and then 2 alts off of those. I want one of those guys in all 3 of those lineups. So kind of shifting gears a little bit, just to talk about some other guys here to fill in. I think I at the other side of that ASU game, Casey Filkins, his price is at 5.8. ASU also giving up, damn near 175 to 200 yards per game on the ground. Filkins, since taking over as the lead back there, with Smith out for the year, has been toting the rock 20 plus times, 3 of 4, heavy volume, and 32 damn carries against Notre Dame in a game that I don't think anyone, including them, thought they would be leading. He's had 3 or more receptions in 4 of the last 5, really just an all-purpose type of guy, which is keeping his fantasy points quite high. He's had double-digit fantasy points in every single game this season. Even when Smith was still playing, he was averaging about 12.5 fantasy points. So a big part of their offense, whether that's passing or rushing. Michael Wilson is out this week or actually out for a long term for Stanford, so they're going to have to rely on Filkins quite a bit more as a receiver at times, and he's going to get a lot of that running opportunity against ASU. So Filkins is a guy that, for me, is kind of interchangeable with Valladay. I do trust Valladay a little bit more, just think his upside's better, but Filkins is just a double-digit fantasy lock, and at 580, still probably a little underpriced for what he's actually going to be able to give us. And then another guy here that would be able to replace into my 3rd spot, I think. And again, it's going to require a little bit of, decision making on my end if I want to, in this Purdue Wisconsin game, what I actually want to do with it. But it's tough to get away from Devin Mockabee after what he just did for us last game. I know he was heavily owned on that night slate, but 30 carries, almost 200 yards on the ground, clearly has pushed his way to the top of the pecking order there. King Duru returned last game, but he's not going to be a factor. He's never really been that solid of a runner always kind of a little bit better of a pass catcher. Kobe Lewis transferred over from CMU. I think he was a little more confident in himself than he, and that's great to be confident in yourself, but clearly not a Big Ten level talent. He can barely get on the field. When he does, he's not doing the things that Maccabee is doing. His price is up to 5.8. It's on the road against Wisconsin. People like Iowa, have it in their brain that Big Ten teams, Wisconsin and Iowa, they're good defenses no matter what. Neither of those teams have really been that good on D. I'm glad you said that about Iowa because, they've had some pretty soft opponents, but even in those games, they haven't looked that great. It's just that they played some pretty porous offenses. Whereas Wisconsin, their defense has given up yardage on the ground, through the air, on the kicking game. Like they just haven't looked very good at all this year. Thus the coaching change. So I think Maccabee, after what he did last week, it'll be the opposite where people would normally chase a performance like that. I think they'll look at the road matchup and say that, they're going to have to throw it because Wisconsin's going to get a lead, blah, 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 whatever. He's still going to get a ton of work. He's catching passes. I think I still want to have exposure to him. And I think that another guy that's under 6K that is main team viable. The running back position, there's really no need to pay up for it this week because of the fact that there's so many viable different options that are going to get work. Bijan Robinson, we say it every week. He's a great play. If you can get him in, he's going to, get over 100 yards or he's going to score, but we need him to get 35, fantasy points to really feel good about it, 30 at minimum. And I'm just going to hope that he stays in that 24 to 27 range and I can feel okay about fading there. Trey Henderson coming back against Iowa, he's 8K. That's an okay price, but Mayan Williams is back as well. Can probably get away from him there. Braylon Allen, I think, is an okay play every week at, 7-4. Sean Tucker at Clemson, that's a tough spot for him. So really, I just don't envision myself playing, the until I get to Sharps or going to Judkins, who just never stops scoring touchdowns. So really definitely a position to go in the mid-range. Now, open forum at the running back. I want to start with Baylor. There is more injuries for Baylor at the running back spot. They've got Reese there as kind of taken over as the RB1, but Craig Williams, one of their backups, who's been getting about 5 to 7 carries per game. He just suffered some sort of injury. I don't believe it was a concussion, but something with his head still. Quaylon Jones at 3K is definitely viable. Reese is still going to get majority of the carries, but Jones there against Kansas will get work. He had 10 carries last week against West Virginia, 44 yards, did score a touchdown, had a couple of receptions. He's actually got 5 receptions in the last 3 games alone. So somebody in a GPV lineup, you want to go super, expensive at the wide receiver spot. You want 2 expensive quarterbacks. You don't love that value anywhere else. Quaylon Jones at 3K with 2 running backs injured for Baylor, a quarterback suffering right now. We could be looking at, 40 plus carries for the Baylor guys of Quaylon Jones and Richard Reese. So those two, combined maybe like a 60-40 type of split, not a 50-50 or anything, but I think Jones could potentially see 12 to 15 touches, if not more, against Kansas. So somebody there at 3K that I really do like. Quite a bit, actually, and I'll have to see how my builds go. I mentioned Judkins there for Ole Miss against LSU. Don't love the matchup. LSU's defense was really good. I think Hendon Hooker proved that they're kind of a paper tiger in that regard, and Judkins just can't be counted out. I mean, that game against Auburn where they dropped almost 50 points on them and he rushed for another 2 touchdowns, 139 yards. Like, this kid is just an unbelievable play. He needs to be priced at like 8 or 9K at this point because every week under the 7K, I have to consider it. I end up fading him because I talk myself out of it, and then he goes off. So another spot where it's really interesting to use him. I think we'll probably see him in the low 20s, so he is fadeable at this almost 7K price point. But again, he scored 2 touchdowns in 4 of his last 5 games. Zach Evans is still scoring. Jackson Dart is still getting a lot of rushing yards, but Judkins just has a nose for the end zone, and I just don't think the LSU is going to be able to stop him. If they pay extra attention to him or they try to stack it up, then they have the horses in the receiving game, and Dart's at least an adequate enough thrower to penalize them in that regard. So they have to play him fairly honest, and Judkins just, man, he hits the hole so hard. I don't know if you've had a chance to watch him play very much this year, but shit, that kid can really run. I don't know. They misforecasted him when they gave him a 3-star. He's definitely a 5-star talent. So I want, continued exposure to Judkins every week, even if it's not in my main lineup. Who are some other running backs that you like this week?
Yeah. So, I mean, Judkins and Evans, like, it's hard to get away from those guys, right? Like, they're you want to play them both. Like, you don't want to play them both in the same lineup. Obviously, that gets a little bit weird. and negative correlation and all that. They're taken away from each other. But if you look back, I mean, they kind of just both get there. They find a way to both get there, and it's because the offense has been scoring so much. I, I would, if you're playing multiple lineups, I would certainly want to have exposure to both of them in different lineups throughout the whole kind of portfolio, I guess. Another guy that we didn't talk about a whole lot after he kind of started. We talked about at the beginning of the season, they weren't really using him much, and they kind of for a couple weeks bumped up his usage and then fell off again. We're talking about Chris Tyree. It would be great if you could tell me that they're going to use Chris Tyree to the best of his ability at 5'6" against a struggling UNLV defense. I think it's pretty interesting, but at the same time, Audrick's team is kind of getting. He's not even really getting more carries. He's just doing more with the carries. And Tyree hasn't really been used in the passing game as much as maybe you would expect him to be. He did have those 2 weeks of 4 and 5 receptions that, sure enough, corresponded to his 2 best fantasy weeks of the season. That's more of like a, hey, I really wish they would do some stuff that made sense, as opposed to thinking that he's a guy that we can really use. And then the other guy that I don't think we talked about really, that did have a moderate week last week. Game script kind of got out of hand, but Devin Neal put up 12 for 84 and a touchdown against Oklahoma in a game that they were trailing essentially from kickoff, right? So game flow not really going Devin Neal's way, but potentially an opportunity to make up for that here with hopefully a little bit better game flow. And in that, especially with Jason being a quarterback, they may be handing it off a little bit more and not doing as many of the designed runs since they're already on a backup quarterback. So, another guy at only 5'3", he's worthy of consideration as well.
Yeah, man, I had lots of Devin Neal last week and was feeling good. He scored that early touchdown, but for some reason they I know game script kind of got out of him, but they went away from him even on the carries. Like in the second half, Kai Thomas.
Yeah, Kai Thomas was more involved in the second.
That pissed me off, man. I had a lot of Devin Neal, and it's not that. I mean, he had 18 yards on his 9 or 10 carries, but something kind of to pay attention there. But yeah, I still like Neal a lot. And then Notre Dame, man. Now we had to worry about Estime. Now they've given Logan Diggs 36 carries in the last 3 games total. So now another guy that Tyree has to compete with. And every week you see the staff, talk about Tyree. He's been here since, forever, all the success on his shoulders. We got to get him involved. We got to get him the rock and all this lip service. And then we go into a game and it's just, they completely go away from him. And then they have a rough game. And then you saw the games where they went back to him. They had good games. So it's very clear what they need to do. I don't know what the hell's going on there, but yeah, hell with them. Hell with that staff. I only got room for one Notre Dame guy, and I'm going to have to probably play damn Michael Mayer. So let's move on to wide receivers, the top 3 here. We mentioned, there's going to be some salary that we can use to pay up for guys, but then I look at wide receiver and the cheapies just jump out everywhere. It does start for me with Zay Flowers, actually, who is just habitually underpriced because Boston College is just having a horrible season. You got Jerkovich finally healthy, but then the O-line, basically all graduate/transfers. They have a really patchwork offensive line. You can tell Jerkovich is on his back a lot, and it's tough to throw the ball when you're constantly running for your life. When he has gotten protection and has been able to throw the ball to Zay Flowers, his target share has been just absolutely massive. 63 total targets on the season. He's caught 41 of those, solid 65% catch rate, over 550 yards, 5 touchdowns. 5.9 is just too cheap for him. Facing off against Wake Forest, this is a Wake Forest team. Again, their defense is not as bad as it probably looks. when you're watching games. But again, you have an offense that scores the football entirely too fast, and their defense just gasses out. So they should be able to take advantage of that to a degree. I think Zay Flowers is probably the most popular running or wide receiver on the slate. This is one where I don't want to get too cute. He's been over double-digit fantasy points in every single game. We see him, have these really nice first halves, and then all of a sudden Jerk just can't get any protection, and then Flowers there's nothing he can do. They do try to get him the ball when that happens in the running game. You saw he had 2 carries a couple weeks ago for 22 yards. They tried to give him a carry against Clemson, but he got stuffed for -2, and then they went away from that. So they got to find ways to get the ball in their best players' hands, but it really just depends on that offensive line. And I think people forget how important that position and that group of players really is to a team's success. So Zay Flowers at 5'9", easy play there. Then we have, like I mentioned, only one Notre Dame player in my main lineup. That's a rule I have to live by. But we have Mayer, sitting there. Michael Mayer, sorry, not Matthew Mayer. So I have Michael Mayer sitting there at 5K after last week, coming into a matchup against Stanford where he was a phenomenal play on that night slate. He, again, was very chalky. He had 5 for 60, not horrible. He had a touchdown called back. After that happened, Notre Dame was deflated, totally, ruined everything for him. He had another one that he was about to catch, and the defender came and hit him late, so it was a pass interference. So 2 really big catches that he would have added to his total. That would have put him over 100 and a touchdown. Now he's coming back against UNLV. Theoretically, it makes sense for them to have to run the ball. They'll probably beat up on UNLV. UNLV started the season hot. Injuries happened at multiple positions. Brumfield can't get healthy. Now Aiden Robbins, their young running back, he can't get healthy. They're not going to be able to score. So if we're playing Mayer at 5K, who is another probable chalky option, we're going to need him to score in the first half before things kind of tail off and they just run the football in the second. But again, I think this is a great opportunity for them to throw the football, get Drew Pine some snaps, some confidence throwing the football. We have heard that and seen that this week as far as chatter. We've had some good success when, going into a couple weeks ago with your guy Jackson Dart, they said, we're going to throw the ball a little bit more against Vanderbilt to get him, some confidence. They did that. There's been a couple of other games, Michigan a couple of weeks ago. We're going to have J.J. McCarthy throw the ball a little bit more to get confident. Oh, was this coach speak? No, they threw the ball more and he looked good doing it. So I do think this is going to be a week where we see Pine, throw it a little bit more before they do go into the run game because they'll be able to stomp this UNLV team. I wish Mayer was like 7K so I could just say, nah, I'll go ahead and fade that away because he's definitely a guy that could put up like 8 because of this game blowing out or just Pine not playing well. But you look at the rest of his games where, they've been in games where you thought they'd be blowouts and they ended up close or losing. Marshall put up 27. UNC, which was a fun game, he put up 21. BYU, which was a really fun game, he had over 100 yards. So he's just way too cheap at 5K. And again, we have this salary to spend. We left all the salary on the table today. Not necessarily going to do that on my main slate for Saturday, but there's just a ton of cheap guys to look at. And then I kind of cheated with my third one here, sticking with this Pac-12 game. We've talked a lot about ASU Stanford, but Michael Wilson is out. Their WR1, their most explosive player. He's going to be out long-term for Stanford. That leaves Elijah Higgins sitting there at 4.4, Bryson Tremaine at 4.9 to absorb those targets. And then the tight end Benjamin Urasek at 3K min price. Urasek, we haven't talked about him at all this year or played him, but you might remember last year, Jake, that we were kind of the first group on him on those secondary slates. He's catching touchdowns for us, putting up 15 to 20 fantasy points at like 5% ownership. And I think this is a nice game to look back to him, and you'll see he's caught at least 3 receptions in 3 straight games. Now you take Wilson out of the equation, and I think we'll see Urasek put up some pretty solid numbers. So like I said, I kind of cheated here, and it's Stanford wide receiver, but I think any one of Tremaine, Higgins, or Urasek makes a lot of sense. Looking at the actual target share for those guys, Urasek 25 targets, Higgins 30, and Tremaine 25. So pretty evenly distributed there. I will say there'll be some frustration because I don't think all 3 will be able to pan out. So you're probably going to want to go with, one of the cheaper side ones, which I would say is probably Higgins as the best play just because he has the higher targets and he scored double-digit fantasy points in 3 straight. And heading into the season, he was technically the WR1, or at least everybody expected him to be. And then going down to Urasek if you need salary. I feel a little bit nervous about Tremaine just because he's a lot more up and down with his performances, and that's been the case throughout his career. So this ASU Stanford game, the hammer game, is actually looking like a pretty decent semi-stack not looking at the quarterbacks, but one of the running backs, and then, possibly even one of the wide receivers. If you play Valladay, running one of the Stanford wide receivers, I think is a pretty strong move. So that's where I'm looking for those three. I need to spend my salary somewhere. Maybe you have somewhere to do that. If you're on Stroud, I have an idea of where you might be talking about, but what are some of the wide receivers here, or your preferred three at this moment in time?
Yeah, we'll get to the Ohio State guys in the kind of open forum section.
Okay.
I'm not necessarily main lineup prioritizing those unless I have Stroud in that particular lineup, in which case then we can get into that. But for the purposes of my top three guys, I think I'm going a little bit off the radar here, and that maybe because it's just such a wide open slate, or maybe because I just tend to pick off the wall oddball wide receivers. But little trivia to start this one off. The leader in catches for West Virginia in weeks 3, 4, 5, and 7. So their last 4 games. Is that anyone but Bryce Ford Wheaton? Like, does anyone but Bryce Ford Wheaton come to mind?
Prather's been pretty. I don't know Prather's exact numbers, but I know he's been pretty damn good lately.
Prather is the leader in catches. Bryce Ford Wheaton tied him 1 week, but 3 of those 4, he was the individual leader in catches for West Virginia, culminating in an 8-109-1 against Baylor in their most recent game this past week, and I don't know where all that's coming from, because at the beginning of the season it was like, man, JT Daniels doesn't even look at anybody but Bryce Ford Wheaton, and so Prather is coming on, extremely consistent. Hasn't had a game of fewer than 6 catches since week 1. And seems to be able to get the ball down the field and has a high enough ADOT that he has decent yardage totals, but a low enough ADOT that he piles up the PPR points. Think we're looking at probably, given the elevated pace that Texas Tech games generally happen at, I think we're looking at probably closer to that 8 catch range as opposed to the 6 catch range, and given how inefficient their tackling is, probably closer to that 100 yards. So if we're projecting him for 8 catches and 100 yards and maybe scores at 5,800, it's a phenomenal game. If he scores again, then he's a must have on the slate kind of guy, right? So I think what we're seeing a little bit is that Bryce Ford Wheaton gathers a lot of the attention of the defense and kind of opens things up for Prather a little bit in as kind of an ancillary option, but he's been efficient and he's made the best of that opportunity. So not necessarily the most explosive guy, but kind of settling into that Cam Camper type role where you're going to get a lot of PPR volume and, might end up in the end zone on one of those catches. And he's scored in 3 of his last 4. So it's not like he's allergic to the end zone either. So that's going to be guy number 1. Guy number 2, and this is as much of a gut play as there will be, because this guy's year has been absolutely terrible relative to expectation. However, new father has had 6 catches in each of his last 2 games since becoming a new father. Most recent of those against Florida, 6 catches for 115 yards, and may be part of the reason that Jaden Daniels is kind of showing up as a decent quarterback now. So we're talking about our boy Kayshon Boutte. Beginning of the season, man, we did that SEC preview, and I was like, can a guy win the Heisman if his team only wins 3 games? And LSU might win more than 3 games. I don't think Kayshon's winning the Heisman. But we did kind of see a flash of, the form that we know he's capable of. And this is a guy that would regularly be like a, 8,200 to 9K wide receiver that we have available at 5,300 in a game that's got one of the highest totals on the slate, with a quarterback that just had, the game of his career, confidence sky high. Now they're playing at home. If you're playing Jackson Dart, if you're playing Judkins, if you're playing Zach Evans, and certainly if you're playing Jaden Daniels, I would give a look to Keyshawn Boutte. And I also think that he's fine to plug in as a piece, not correlated to anybody else that's in that game, but just, of his own merit. I think there's a lot of explosiveness that we've seen in the past, and we're yet to see this season. That I think this is a spot that is very ripe for it to come to the forefront. So we're going to go with him as guy number 2, and we haven't gone over 6K yet, and we're not going to do it here with our third guy. So maybe we can get our resident Baylor expert in on this guy, whether it was chemistry with the backup quarterback, or just weird things that happen when you play West Virginia, because their defense isn't too good. But you're going to have to explain to me what happened with Gavin Holmes, because I missed that one. But 7-10-1 after no more than 3 catches in any other game this season. Is that a breakout game, or is that an anomaly?
That's an outlier to me, but we'll see. Maybe he's having the Quentin Johnson treatment here, and he's going to break out now. But that looks way like an outlier.
So yeah, it is. But you also get that matchup with Kansas that just got absolutely destroyed on defense when they're playing Oklahoma, and I think there's probably a Baylor receiver that has a gotta have it kind of game in this game. I don't necessarily know who it is. The guy that showed out in the most recent game and has a sub 5K price tag is at least as interesting to anyone else. So as of right now, I'm gonna main team receiver Gavin Holmes, and if it ends up being Monterey Baldwin instead, or if they end up handing it off a billion times, or if there's somebody else that kind of jumps up and has a big game, we'll see what the research leads to, and what the tea leaves are saying early on Saturday morning. But as of right now, we're going to include Gavin Holmes on the main team.
Whoo, that is a deep one. I wasn't expecting that, but yeah, I mean, I liked Baldwin a lot last week in that matchup, and of course he didn't do a whole hell of a lot, and he's priced way out of play at 7.5. That's just, he may very well play, score a lot, but he can't pay that price. So Holmes makes sense. Sims is kind of nice as like a safer option, but he might not have that type of upside, but he's like an 8-9 fantasy point game at minimum, sitting there at 4.6. But yeah, we'll have to definitely get the take from our Baylor guy, because he's talking Baylor stack. So he may even be on Holmes, because he likes drones for some reason, but Chapin was actually throwing the ball early and often to Holmes in that one. So it was really, really weird. So yeah, that's definitely, I wasn't expecting that. Threw me for a loop. Other wide receivers here as we get into the open form, Charlie Jones for Purdue, he had a chalk explosion last week on the night slate for us, 12, 132 and 2. He's been playing banged up pretty much all season. He's banged up again. I don't think there's any chance he doesn't play this week. Sitting there at 7.8, if you have that salary and you need a pay up, Charlie Jones is always a guy that's going to be relatively safe. I know he had that real bad game against Maryland, but you can really throw that one out and expect to score like 18 to 20 fantasy points at minimum. O'Connell loves him now that the running game of Purdue is starting to actually blossom a little bit for the first time in almost 3 years. it's going to make things even easier for Jones. So you have to definitely look at him there depending on his injury status. But again, I don't think he's going to be out. Tyler Scott for Cincinnati, he's listed as questionable right now on Twitter. He knocked out of last game sitting there against SMU. Him and their wide receiving core has been really, really good. Trey Tucker, Martiner a couple of times, but with their quarterback situation as it is with injuries and like their running game, you can definitely probably get away from them. But depending on Scott's status, Trey Tucker sitting there at 6'2" in a matchup against an SMU team that, yes, we know they get blitzed in the running game, but their games just turned into shootouts anyways. There could be a lot of points here. And without Scott, I think Tucker ends up getting a Charlie Jones-like target share potentially. So somebody that I just want to mention with the injury tag and looking there, I will leave Ohio State to you. Jake Bobo sitting there at 6'8". If you want a pairing partner for DTR and you're not on Sharps, Bobo has been the guy for him. Early season, it was Kaz Allen. I thought, wow, Kaz Allen's going to be DTR's guy. And then he really kind of fell off, had a decent midseason game like a couple weeks ago, but it's really been Jake Bobo. Obviously, he torched my Huskies. Everybody does. But the game he had against Utah, 2 touchdowns. There's only 3 for 22, but in the red zone, he's looking his way, catch the 2 touchdowns. Really, absolutely solid. So at 6'8", if you have that salary, not a price point I'd normally be looking to pay for him, but we've really recommended, we've done the opposite of what a lot of other groups and sites will do. Hey, you got to play this guy. Okay, but by the time you've got all those guys plugged in, you're negative 400,000 salary. This is a situation where we've talked up a big group of players that are very cheap. You may end up having some salary to actually play with and potentially upgrade. The problem is when I look at the upgrades, I'm not seeing a lot that I like. I don't want to play for Baldwin. I'm not that excited about Rashee Rice at 7'9", even though he's been great. The Ohio State guys are there. A.T. Perry I'm at 7'4" is okay. I know he had a nice game last time out, but Hartman really spreads the ball out, so I'm not that excited about him. Ford Whedon, Badger, Toe Franklin. Like, there's just nobody above 7K that I really feel like, hey, I got to have them in my lineup. I will say the Texas guys are interesting if even if you're not playing Ewers. 2 weeks ago, we were really high on the tight end from Texas, Jatavian Sanders. I didn't have a cheap guy last week that I was super gung-ho about. His price is still 3.7. I am moving back towards saying Jatavian Sanders is a very intriguing option against Oklahoma State. A really, really good matchup. Wasn't there targets-wise. Ohio State, a much tougher defense. I thought that would be the situation. Still came out of there with 3 catches, but his touchdown equity is very high. There's going to be a lot of points scored in this game, and again, he's still priced at 3.7. We don't need him because there's such a good balanced mid-range group of guys that we can run a balanced lineup. But at 3.7, I do feel like this is a week you can bounce back to Sanders and feel good about it at 2% ownership. So a couple of guys there. Who are some other ones that you're looking at on top of the inevitable Ohio State guys?
Yeah. So Caden Prieskorn, did we get there in the Memphis game?
No, who we've loved. We used him a bunch. His price is a little murky,
his price is way up, right? And like that was kind of the advantage of using Prieskorn is like you'd get him in like that low to mid 4K range kind of, right? That's where we're seeing him. And so like now he's the same price as Mayer and you're like, well shoot, why wouldn't I just play Mayer? Well, you wouldn't just play Mayer because Prieskorn is playing in a much better game environment and isn't like a 20 some odd point favorite, right? So like that game is going to be a lot more back and forth and he's probably going to have a lot more opportunities to be involved in the offense and just unreal consistency with regard to getting in the end zone. Somehow didn't get in last week against ECU, but he did go for 6 catches and 104 yards. And yeah, they got some overtime work in there, so that's inflated a little bit. But even if he has the normal 4 to 5 catch, 60 to 70 yard game and gets a touchdown, it's still compelling at that price. And if he has upside from there because it's a pretty good game environment, that's going to be interesting. But without further ado, yes, we're going to talk about JSN, and they've been slow playing it all year, man. He had he had the season we thought he was going to have, he would be in the conversation for, I don't know about number one overall pick, because I don't think a receiver goes number one overall ever. But certainly like a Jamar Chase, consider him within the top 5 to 8 overall picks in the drafts. That's the kind of talent that he has. And he showed that, in the Rose Bowl last year, just unreal game. That was the last true JSN game that we've seen. He's been banged up, and he came back and played against freaking Toledo or Akron or something like that. Caught a couple passes and called it a day. And so we haven't really seen a signature JSN game at home against Iowa, a team that everybody says, oh man, can Ohio State topple this tenacious Iowa defense? Yes, absolutely they can. We're probably, if I had to guess the alignment, I'm guessing they're still going to go Harrison and Igbuka on the outside, JSN in the slot, which means that the third best corner on Iowa will generally be the one trying to keep up with JSN, who's had 5 weeks now to recover from his hamstring injury, and I don't think that he would play in this one unless he was 90% or better. I don't know if a hamstring injury ever gets back to 100%. In season, but he's had plenty of time to get there. And if he's ready to go and good enough to play, I think he's good enough to dominate. And so he is 7K. So that is a spot where, especially if you're playing Stroud, if you're playing Stroud and not playing JSN, that's not really the way that I would approach it. But you can play JSN either way. I think, there's just so much, he just oozes so much potential for, sub 5% ownership and 180 yards and 3 touchdowns. Like that is well within the realm of possibility given his talent level. And the fact that they can't even really just key on him, right? Like they've got to worry about the running game with Henderson and Williams. They've got to worry about the two on the outside. They've got to worry about Cade Stover at tight end. They've got to worry about Julian Fleming when he sees the field. If they go, a 4 wide set, they can't completely forget about Stroud running the ball, which he might do a little bit in this one. And all of that to say, the best weapon in football is probably being forgotten about. Both a little bit by Iowa's defense and a lot of it by DFS players, and I think that's a complete mistake. So I'm not guaranteeing it. It's not one of those things where we can lock him in for 10 catches and 150 yards, but the ceiling is absolutely there, and if it happens, it will be at very low ownership. So very, very interested in JSN in particular. That said, Buka and Harrison are also great. I'm not as into Fleming in a game where JSN is back and will be featured. I'm not into the running backs at all, just because number one, they're gonna split, and number two, this is going to be a Stroud game. I see this being so much of the passing game because Ohio State wants to prove that their passing weapons can go up against anyone and want to blow the doors off of a conference opponent. So any of the three of Harrison, JSN, and Igbuka are good plays, but I like JSN quite a bit more than the other two. And a little bit anticlimactic, I'm going to throw in some Texas Tech receivers as well. So Miles Price, we don't know if he's going to go quite yet. It seems like we don't really know much about Texas Tech. They're keeping things pretty close to the vest. Good for them. I think whether or not Miles Price goes, I'm probably going to have the most interest in Trey Cleveland. He not that he's shown the most consistency, but he has been the most consistent guy lately, putting up 9 catches for 100 yards against Oklahoma State in the game that Baron Morton was the featured quarterback. So if we get some sort of indication that Baron Morton is going to be the quarterback and primarily or entirely the quarterback, that makes me even more interested in Trey Cleveland, but want to watch that. And then obviously, Miles Price, if he plays, is potentially going to be interesting, but it's a roulette wheel. Drea Bradley came back and also had a very good game against Oklahoma State after, starting out hot and then disappointing us for several weeks. Came back with 119 and 9. So would be another Baron Morton beneficiary. So that would be a pretty inexpensive stack, actually, if you wanted to go with, if we get clarity on Morton, Cleveland, and Bradley, that's saving a lot of money elsewhere. Maybe you pair those guys with Stroud, JSN, and Egbuka and just get all the receiving points. So yeah, just one last piece on the receiving side. I do kind of have some interest in the Texas Tech guys if we get news that it's Morton, clearly as the quarterback.
Absolutely. One other receiver I want to mention on the Syracuse side, Oronde Gadsden II. He has been just phenomenal, over 100 yards receiving in 3 of his last 4. Clearly here to stay. He's just, a really strong piece. Syracuse having an actual wide receiver we can rely on. 31 catches on 37 targets, 507 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Not maybe the greatest spot against Clemson, but also this Clemson defense hasn't been that lockdown unit. They've given up some pretty hefty scores to adequate teams, at least in terms of through the air. They're giving up almost 260 yards, whereas on the rushing side, they're holding teams under 100. So it's a spot where Tucker may struggle, but I think the passing game of Syracuse could still do some damage. So Gadsden is a guy who his price is up. We're paying, the higher tag for him, but GPP wise, it's a heat check situation. All right, so that is the slate there. Let's move to 3-man core time, and start with actually I'll go first this time. I always have you go first. Give you a second. Core wise, quarterback. It's DTR for me. I'm feeling very confident, like I was the last 2 weeks with Spencer Sanders. DTR is just going to do some dirty things to Oregon, so I'm loving him. I am going to core at running back spot. There's a couple of that we overlapped on, but Xavier Valladay I think is going to be that position for me, but also love Sharps. And then at wide receiver, it gets really quite dicey, but it's easy. And what I mean by dicey is there's just a lot of different options that could potentially shit the bed, could potentially break the slate. Going to be some spread out ownership, but Zay Flowers is one that, I'm being boring here, but in a single entry environment, Zay Flowers has to be in your main lineup, I believe. What's your 3-man core looking like?
So I'm going to go Quinn Ewers, Valladay, and Kayshon Boutte.
Love it. Boutte is awake. Was the beast has been awoken and coming alive. All right, so moving over to PrizePicks, I have some that I'm feeling pretty good. We hit 4 or 5 last week on my main 5 pick. It was Jaden Ott of all people who failed me against Colorado. Didn't expect that. There are quite a few here that I like, but I'll give 3 right now, then get some of yours, and then we'll talk about any remaining. But Dorian Thompson-Robinson. His combined passing, rushing, receiving touchdowns, that's a category I know you like to delve into, is sitting at 2.5. I love that. 2 passing, 1 rushing seems like an inevitable outcome. So I'm taking the over there. I am going back to Jaden Ott, even though he failed against Colorado, going up against my Washington Huskies on the 3-game late night slate on Saturday. His combination, just learn how to speak, combination rushing and receiving yards sits at 100.5. He's had several games where he's been like 78 to 80 rushing yards, but then he's caught 15 to 30 yards. So going against some of my Huskies who can't tackle, I think he's looking at a combination of probably almost 150 yards. Very confident back on him again. And then Frank Harris, UTSA. This was a game they could have had on the slate, UTSA versus North Texas. Should be lots of points scored in that one. I think it carries a total of 72.5. Frank Harris's passing yards are sitting at 305.5. He, of course, has one of, if not the best receiver room in the country. 305.5 is something he can do in his sleep. He will throw for 400 yards in this particular game. So slam the over on that. And you can slam the over pretty confidently up to like 330. But those are the three primary prize picks for me. I do have, like I said, several others, but let's bounce over to you and get some of yours, because you've been running hot on prize picks, especially last week.
Yeah. So thus far, and these first two are going to be no surprise if you listen to the core or the running back and receiver sections. But I've got David Valladay over 95.5 rushing yards. Again, every game in which they've been competitive, he's been well over 100. So I think 95.5 is an easy number for him to be shooting at. And then also going along with the DFS and core, Keyshawn Boutte, 55.5 receiving yards. The one game that he's had his head right in, he went for 115, and that was on the road at Florida. And so now that Jaden Daniels has developed some chemistry with him, I think 55.5 is probably a second quarter number. Gonna go a little bit more off the radar and into a category that's really, historically been more of your specialty. I guess, Valladay falls under that too, but I'm going to go Zach Evans over 80.5 rushing yards. Think that, both he and Judkins probably get over 100. And Judkins is at 91.5. So I kind of am just happy to take the lower of the two, whoever that is any given week. I'll take the lower one for the over, because they're just every week they seem to both get there. And Evans does seem to have some of the earlier game work, and I think he should have a lot of room to run. And then this one went up since I hit it, but I think it's still, in plus territory. Jerkovich, I got that at the passing yards at 200.5, took the over on that. It has since gone up to 205.5. Wake's defense, just not great. And, also, them coming off of a service academy game in which, obviously they didn't get a lot of passing going against them in the Army game, may kind of deflate the projected QB1 against passing yard total. And so Jerkovich, they'll be trailing. He'll be throwing a lot. We don't need him to be efficient to get over 205.5. And he has Zay Flowers that could go 75 yards for a touchdown at any time, as you pointed out. So I think I'm pretty confident in that one, even at 5 yards higher than when I hit it. So those are kind of my main ones for the slate that we've been kind of talking about and focused on. I am going to throw in, just because it is kind of for the brand. There is a night slate that I will be writing up. There is UCF on that night slate, and that means that we're going to be super interested in the exploits of one John Reese Plumlee. Let's see if we can find his. Okay, so John Rice Plumlee, 28.5 fantasy score. He ended up with like 60 points last week. And he's, in a 68 or something total, ridiculous total against ECU. That game's going to be back and forth, exactly the kind of offensive environment in which he thrives. ECU, not a particularly compelling defense. I'm going to add him to the mix. John Rice Plumlee over 28.5 fantasy points.
Love it. He's been amazing this year. Speaking of taking the lower number, when you were talking about Evans and Judkins, if I like Frank Harris's passing yards, then it makes sense to target maybe one of his receivers. And I like to generally just take between Franklin, Cephas, and Clark, the lower of the three. Corian Clark sitting there at 70.5 receiving yards. Was on it a couple of weeks ago against WKU, and he failed me, but I do like him to hit that over this week in that spot. We did mention, or you did, Cade Prieskorn, his receiving yardage is sitting at 40.5. I like that. Day Hunter of Liberty, 14.5 fantasy points. He has scored a touchdown in every single game except for their first, and he's been over 78 rushing yards in every game since week 2. So, we're going to get, 80 to 100 rushing yards, a touchdown. He is contributing pretty well in the passing game. He has 14 receptions for 120 yards and a score this week or this season. So the 14.5 just feels a little bit low in a spot against BYU where there's going to be lots of points. I like him for like 20 fantasy points. He would have been a DFS play if that game was there. So I'm on that. And then also I've been riding Roma Dunes every week. He's been killing it. They have him up to 105 now, or 100.5 now. So I'm backing off there. Instead, I'm looking to his counterpart, Jalen McMillan, who sits at 63.5 receiving yards. He hit 77 last week. Going up against Cal, they're a slow-paced team. Maybe this isn't a great spot to look at Rome, but I think Jalen McMillan, with that extra defensive attention paid to Rome, will hit somewhere between 70 to 80 receiving yards. So I like that one as well. And then one other receiver for receiving yards. I'm about the receiving yards this week, I guess. Elijah Cooks of San Jose State, over 73.5. He's healthy. I say it a lot, actually. A healthy Elijah Cooks is one of the best receivers in the country. Chivon Cordero is finding him, in stride a lot. They're connecting on big plays, and I think 100-yard receiving game is inevitable for him as long as he continues to stay healthy. Hasn't been able to do it for a full season in a long time, but fingers crossed that it continues. So those are the PrizePicks numbers. Lots of good ones. Make sure you guys get those in before they change the next 24 hours. There will be quite a bit of movement. Moving over to the betting market opportunities. If you watch that Bet-Sided show, there was a few that I gave there, but UCLA +6 against Oregon. Love that. I don't think this is going to be one where either team wins by more than 3. I do like Syracuse +13.5 against Clemson. Last year it was a 3-point game. This is an entirely different Syracuse team. Babers tends to play the Clemson, squad pretty close. They've only won like one game in their last 8 tries, but they continue to play them extremely close, keeping it under 14 points. And they've covered in 4 of their last 6 against Clemson. So I like the +13.5 there as well. And then just a couple of props, like to give those, on the show here if we like PrizePicks and all that. Jatavian Sanders over 38.5 receiving yards. If I'm not going to use him in DFS, I like to hit that. It's -115 on DK. Speaking of Keishon Butte, they have his receiving yards at 51.5. So Jake's pretty high on them. That's one to potentially look at betting there at that 51.5 number. And then down here in the Washington game, Jalen McMillan, 64.5, 1 more yard than he is on PrizePicks. I still really like that. And on the rushing side for Jaden Ott, it's 77.5 rushing yards. I am hitting the over on that as well. We saw Sharbo, against my Huskies kill him. Everybody expects the Huskies secondary to get just plundered, but they are also not stopping other teams' running backs. It's just their offense is outscoring teams when they're at home, and on the road, they just are running out of gas. So we'll see, because this is a road game against Cal. Jaden Ott should benefit with a 100-yard rushing game. All right, before I get your final words, we have the NFL guys popping in, because I think people, what they do is they see FTN show and they just assume it's whatever with NFL. I always pledge to answer one question. Donald Trump's hair, nice name, asks, I'm 2-4.5 PPR. Should I trade for a WR or ride it out with Khalil Herbert, Garrett Wilson, Jeff Wilson, Gus Edwards, Mahomes, Mixon, Mike Williams, and Amari Cooper? You've just had some bad luck with those guys. I will say that you should make a trade. Always make a trade. Speaking of trades, McCaffrey was traded to the 49ers, which I believe is one of your teams. So you're probably excited about that. But that's our NFL answer for the show. You hadn't been there last week to ask me anything about NFL, and I had a special guest host, and I was setting up the NFL talk, and it never came. But any final words? We're heading into a week where people are a little bit, just finally coming down off the high from last week with, Min Cash being a 222-point score. Do you have any words of wisdom here in a slate or just in general a day of football where the scoring is probably going to be a little more normalized?
Yeah. Well, so first, I am absolutely excited about Christian McCaffrey. I'm a little bit nervous for the fact that we don't have anything before a 5th round pick in next year's draft. But you know what? Next year. You can only win the Super Bowl this year. So
Love it.
Love Christian McCaffrey. Let's ride. So back to college football. A few weeks back, I was on Blake Corum when no one was on Blake Corum because he was playing somebody that was supposedly good. I think that was Iowa, and Blake Corum smashed. The week after that, I was on Julian Fleming, and he did okay. He rewarded us with 85 yards and touchdown or something like that. It was a decent game. It wasn't the big blow up game that I was hoping for, but it was a good game. I am going, and last week I was out with being in Europe, so didn't have the chance to plant my flag. But this week I'm going a little bit more conventional with the flag planting, and it's going to be Xavier Valade Day. I think we are going to get, let's call it 150 and 3 total touchdowns, one of which will be receiving from Xavier Valade. So he's going to be my guy this week.
Love it, man. I was about to say you're developing your own football version of the posh play of the day, but I will have to see what Valade's ownership ends up being. But I definitely like that call. He's going to have a great game. I agree. All right, rest of the week here. Q&A show Saturday morning at 8 a.m. PST. That's where we'll all come on and talk about any last minute injury stuff there is with Texas Tech and a few other spots that we'll have to monitor. So definitely tune in for that. Ask your questions and any further develops. The NC State superfan that we have, Alex, he actually on that particular show, I was talking up. Somebody had asked me about Puka Nacua, who had a good game, but I said that Cody Epps had kind of usurped as the at least the WR2. Had a nice game. He ended up binking the $27 on that slate. So congrats for that. Definitely some good kernels of information by tuning into that show. As far as written content goes, there'll be a Friday morning or Friday, slate breakdown for tomorrow's 2-gamer. Saturday main slate. Jake is back after a 1 week, hiatus with Michael Govier covering it. He'll be doing the night slate, and then in the Discord as usual, we'll talk up the late night slate with the 3-gamer. You'll want to definitely play this one because the Huskies are on it. And the last time the Huskies were on a late night slate, we absolutely murdered with a low-owned Rome Odunze. So lots of football coming up and lots of grinding. College basketball less than 20 days away. So much going on. I can't wait. It's collegiate sports, money-making opportunities. Let's get it. My name's Walt. That's Jake. We're out of here. Best of luck this weekend, guys. See ya.